Welcome to the Wheat's on Your Mind podcast. I'm Aaron Harries. Wheat's on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, we are visiting with Peter Laudeman with U.S. Wheat Associates and Justin Gilpin, the CEO of Kansas Wheat. Peter Laudeman is Director of Trade Policy for U.S. Wheat Associates, based out of Washington, D.C. U.S. Wheat Associates is the export market development organization for the U.S. wheat industry. They are funded through checkoff dollars from 17 state wheat commissions and cost share grants from USDA's Foreign Agriculture Service. Recently, Peter and our own Justin Gilpin took a food aid journey to Africa, and they are here to share stories from this trip, which I'm sure was very interesting. So, Peter, tell us a little bit about the origins of this trip, how you decided where you're going, what the purpose of the trip was.
Absolutely, Aaron. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to talking a little bit about food aid here, and especially the food aid learning journey we were able to go on recently. I think big picture, food aid is one of those areas that's definitely a unique export market, but definitely an important one as well. It makes up kind of a top 10 export destination, and so something that definitely makes an impact on the wheat balance sheet, something we want to see kind of higher, more stable volumes of wheat moving in the future. And so we're always kind of looking at different angles of the food aid landscape and trying to figure out how to make it work a little bit better. One of the ways that we've done that historically is by taking these food aid learning journeys where we know a lot about the front end of those programs, producing wheat, getting it out of the country. We don't always have as much of a hands-on perspective with how it's used by whether it's the World Food Program or other NGOs and delivering it to hungry people on kind of the back half. And so these food aid learning journeys really help kind of fill that gap and let us see kind of a little bit more the full supply chain for food aid and give us a little bit better insight into how to make it work even better than it is today. When we were looking for destinations and places to go, there's all kinds of challenges in saying, how do you go see something that's worthwhile but also safe? Anybody who follows food aid very closely knows that probably most of our wheat in recent years has gone to Ethiopia and Yemen. Neither of those are super great places to visit right now, especially in the regions that distribute the food assistance. And so you have to be a little bit more creative in looking at some more places that are still really valuable to food aid, but also safe to visit. That's where Kenya kind of comes in as this sweet spot, as somewhere that has a massive refugee population from around kind of all of East Africa, covers a variety of different countries, but also is relatively safe and stable as kind of a country itself. So that's kind of where we teed up Kenya. We've got kind of a great relationship with the World Food Program. That's the primary operator of food aid in Kenya. And so they were more than happy to kind of host us on this trip and showcase some of the work that they're doing with U.S. wheat at some points in the past and also with other U.S. commodities.
Yeah, so I know, Peter, you've been on previous trips to see this kind of thing, and Justin, this was a first. You've been to Africa, but not seeing what the things you saw, and folks listening may want to pull up a map of Africa in front of you when we talk to Justin here, so you familiarize yourself with the geography. So, Justin, I've chatted with you, quite an experience it sounds like, so give us a little bit of a flight pattern here of where you went and what you saw.
Well, certainly it was something that I have never been able to experience before, and Peter did a great job in arranging this using his contacts. And just such a dynamic time to take a trip like this with all of the attention around USAID and policy uncertainty and trying to get a better understanding of how the food aid actually works, not just from what we always talk about, whether it's a food for peace program or food for progress program, but to actually be able to see it firsthand, where the warehouses at the port, the logistics it takes to actually get to the humanitarian assistance need points, and to be able to witness and see firsthand food distribution at a refugee camp. All of those unfortunate stories that are associated with that and the help that it's bringing to those people, knowing that those commodities are produced by farmers. It really was a kind of almost the best way I could describe it is emotionally exhausting, is what I kind of told you, Aaron, be able to see that. But my whole career, we've always talked about the importance of food aid and food for peace specifically, and what that means, and to actually be able to witness it and see it firsthand really helped put a lot of things in perspective. And Peter, I think you can talk a little bit more about, with everything that's happening with the uncertainties and potential changing dynamics within policy, being able to see that, but then also be able to come back and give our firsthand accounts of the accountability of the logistics that are in place to help tell a good story about the history of food programs, food aid programs, but also the specific direct needs for those humanitarian assistance food aid programs right now. I think we have a responsibility to kind of convey that and think of ways to try to make that continue in a beneficial manner.
You visited Kenya first, if I'm correct. What did you see there?
Well, Peter, I'll turn it over to you, but we started off in Nairobi, and then Peter put together a very aggressive schedule, and Peter had us leaving at 4 o'clock in the morning every morning, jumping on a plane, jumping somewhere. But Peter, you can fill us in on the aggressive schedule we put together.
Yeah, happy to kind of jump in there on the sort of logistics of everywhere we went. I think Justin made the joke a few times on the trip that if we had a spare hour in the schedule, then I found another meeting for us. And it really is just so much to see in such a short amount of time that you try and kind of squeeze in as much as possible, but definitely made sure to wear out the group over the course of the week in Kenya. Started off in Nairobi, where we were primarily meeting with more of the sort of leadership and decision-making type of folks or food aid programs in the country. So this is the World Food Program's leadership that's at their compound in Nairobi, as well as folks at World Vision, another kind of partner of the World Food Program that does some of the last mile distributions. Met with the UN Food and Ag Organization that does a little bit different version of food security, a little bit more on sort of the data reporting side of things, as well as kind of a few smallholder agriculture development projects. So a lot of those more kind of, strategic programming sort of meetings to start with. Then we were able to get into probably the most impactful part of the trip that Justin mentioned briefly, going up to a refugee camp in Kakuma, so just about 100 kilometers from the South Sudan border, where there's a refugee camp that's been there for a couple of decades. It's got refugees from all over the region, whether that's Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They've got a very diverse population there, but it's always been somewhere that's had dramatic need. I think they're serving around 200,000 refugees in that camp today. They look at a situation where they'd like to provide a food basket that's about 100% of what your minimum caloric intake would be. And so this is bare basic calories, so not a well-rounded fruits and vegetables sort of meal, but just what is the minimum calorie count. When I was at that same refugee camp about a year ago, they had cut back to 65% ration. They're even lower when we were at the refugee camp this year, and they're going to cut even more dramatically back in the next couple of months here. And so you've seen a situation that has hundreds of thousands of people from all across Eastern and Central Africa that has dramatic need. The resources to fill that need have just been declining consistently and causing some really challenging circumstances in that camp. And so it's pretty impactful to be able to see that firsthand, see just what the sort of physical representation of those ration cuts looks like. I think it took a lot away for the group that was able to be there. And then we rounded out the trip after kind of the day in Kakuma, also spent a good day and a half in Mombasa, which is kind of one of the primary East African port cities where the World Food Program brings in a lot of their food, wheat, and other commodities they use not only in Kenya, but really across the region. So it's sort of a logistics and transportation hub that was a lot more familiar to some of the commercial shipping aspects that U.S. Wheat is very familiar with, even outside of food aid.
And is that a fairly modern port? Was it built by the UN, the World Food Program?
Well, no, that's a port that actually feeds all of East Africa. So it's certainly a modern port that has expanded and continues to expand. And being able to see that firsthand was also really rewarding to be able to witness that, knowing that port 20 years ago was taking in about 400,000 tons of bulk grain, whereas this year I think they were telling us that they're going to be right at about 3.5 million. So it kind of tells you how they've expanded their infrastructure, but then also how there continues to be a growing need in that region. And so when you think about food aid programs, the history of food aid programs, and that's one of the purposes that you really try to accomplish and have past accomplishments through our food aid programs over the years is, one, being able to knowing we've got the grain to be able to help feed people. They use our policy to put in place to get commodities grown in the United States, using that taxpayer dollar, the velocity of that dollar, helping at the farm gate level, helping that local co-op, helping that local community, and moving that grain to a U.S. port, then with U.S. port workers loading that on a ship and then delivering it to help those people, and with the end goal of, one, immediately helping address an emergency situation, feeding people that need food today, but you're also using that policy and that program and helping build goodwill, and with the end goal of helping, once you help give some stability in that region by giving that assistance, that hopefully in those regions they can build their own infrastructure and economy. And with that goodwill, and then the long-term play with food aid programs is potentially can expand, introduce our product into a market and help build on commercial relationships. And so being able to see firsthand the expansion of that port, the need in that region, and being able to use programs like Food for Peace or Food for Progress to introduce U.S. grown wheat into that region really helped bring it full circle for me.
Peter, I want to paint a clear picture for people listening here who may not be familiar with Food for Peace and Food for Progress. So that refugee camp, where do those funds come from, and why have they been decreased or decreasing recently?
You got a lot of different things at play, but you're hitting a good point here, Aaron, that there are two biggest food aid programs, certainly for wheat, that we talk about are Food for Peace and Food for Progress, that are very different but very confusingly have similar names. Food for Peace is the one that is kind of the more traditional model that folks might think about. That's the U.S. government basically buying food. So that's a program that's authorized by the Farm Bill, appropriated through the annual ag appropriations process. Those funds go to both USDA and historically USAID as kind of the co-administrators of the program. And then they buy wheat and other commodities from U.S. farmers and contract the shipping, usually through a partnership with the World Food Program or Catholic Relief Services, and then deliver that food through refugee camps and other sort of community-based outreach to starving people all around the world. Food for Progress is a little bit different. It's more of less of the kind of direct feeding program and more of a sort of two-tiered market development program where on one side you have the government purchases wheat in the United States and then sells it on kind of a local market. So that might be Tanzania, for example. The reason the government's doing this sort of purchase and sale is because the government facilitation allows us to get wheat into places that otherwise might not be quite at a commercial competitive place. So usually there's a slight discount for the buyer and an opportunity for them to buy U.S. wheat, a little bit of a discount to the market, see the quality, see why it's beneficial to their mill, and work on that more long-term market development. Then the government takes the proceeds from those sales and uses it to fund a kind of complementary agricultural development project. So that's something we were able to see later in the trip where the funds from a wheat sale in Tanzania were funding a smallholder project in Lesotho that was working on poultry sector development. Lots of different kind of overlapping funding streams and whatnot, but that's kind of the general overview.
Yeah, and I think we want to follow up on that Lesotho, but I think it's important to point out with that changing dynamic with USAID, right? I mean, I think Aaron and I, on previous podcasts, we've talked about the history of that Food for Peace program starting by farmers and the long history of support for that Food for Peace program and how that was shifted into USAID. And I think even on this podcast, I think I probably have been somebody that was critical of USAID in the past and on some of the course direction that we've seen and changes in how they are handling maybe less U.S. commodities and using more cash. And I don't think any of us really anticipated to see the drastic change that's happening within USAID and the disruption that's causing on that aid distribution. But I think that's one of the reasons why we've been working really hard on trying to say, how to preserve these programs and do it in an accountable way. And USDA may be a really good fit for that Food for Peace program to find some continuity with the program. So I don't know, Peter, you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty important angle that can get a little bit kind of confusing just with kind of some periodic news articles and whatnot that sometimes get it right and sometimes get it wrong. I mean, like you're saying, Justin, is we've had a variety of different challenges with USAID historically, that the program certainly wasn't operating the way that we would think it could operate best. I had a really hard time having some of those conversations and seeing real change take place versus the kind of roles that USDA was playing in the program generally went really well. They're really receptive to the farmer audience. They've gone really well. So when you saw kind of one of President Trump's day one executive orders say, hey, we need to really think harder about how we do foreign assistance and kind of out of that see a substantial pause in those resources, see a change in how we're going to administer those resources, That's very much a conversation that we've been teeing up for probably many years now and are kind of still trying to decipher a little bit what things will look like moving forward. I think the encouraging part is that both prior to the Trump administration and through the Trump administration today, the U.S. remains the most generous country in the world when it comes to international food assistance. We give away more international food resources than the rest of the world combined. That's been one area of foreign aid that folks have generally agreed. So this is a good way to do foreign aid, especially when we're buying products from American farmers, have a little bit of that symbiotic relationship. The sort of stage or hurdle that we're at now is just how do we make sure this program can function steadily and better for the long term, where it didn't work the way we would entirely want it to in the past. And that's definitely through having a home for the program at USDA. As USAID has kind of been fragmented and kind of figured out kind of where the remaining parts of that are going to go, we're very confident that the Food for Peace program needs to live at the U.S. Department of Agriculture if it's going to have a viable path forward in the future.
Before we do move on to the next leg of your journey, Justin, I want to give you a chance to give us a visual of what a refugee camp looks like. Not every one of us gets an experience to see that, so maybe what your expectations are, but what you actually saw.
It helped me understand what we were getting ready to see just by when we were in Nairobi and we knew we were going to go to Kakuma, our driver kind of saying, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea, guys. And Peter had to remind him that we were going to jump on a plane and fly up there within 60 kilometers and then had a convoy that we drove up to the refugee camp. That specific refugee camp has actually been there for 30 years. And so it was really eye-opening to me also to really understand that refugees and displacement of people and populations is so much due to conflict. And with everything that's going on right now, whether it's Somalia or Sudan or Ethiopia and now happening in the DRC, these are people who have fled by not because of famine or drought or just they're being dislocated just because of the circumstances beyond their control, and they're there to try to find some day-to-day subsistence, and they come to these refugee camps. It's very spread out, trying the challenges of daily of getting water, then food distribution is for a month at a time, and just the number of young people and kids at this camp, I think, was probably what was something I wasn't prepared for, and just seeing that and knowing that the reliance that they have on the programs in place by World Food Program, World Vision, and other NGOs that are actually doing that food delivery, humanitarian assistance was something that is something that I'll probably never forget. Right? I mean, and it was really being able to actually be part of that, seeing the lines for the food distribution, standing there as they're weighing out grain that each individual was going to get, seeing how that all was taking place, and just seeing people and looking people in the eyes, and just knowing that can't even imagine the circumstances that they're going through, but knowing that we've been able to at least help them in some little way was good to see. But then to think through what potentially with those hundreds of thousands of people that have been dislocated at those refugee camps, what would happen if you do have just a complete disruption in those delivery mechanisms for that assistance, the destabilization that might cause is something I'm sure the Kenyan government is being, and a lot of countries in Africa are being very cognizant of, and that's probably one of the things that we are trying to convey in our message of trying to find some continuity in programs for these food assistance programs if they are going to need to be restructured and built back in a way that's going to be better. Quicker we can do that, the better, because we've got the grain and they've got the need, and we hopefully can find a way to get that done, Aaron.
Yeah, I think one of the things you said that struck me is that people have lived their entire lives in this camp. Is that correct?
The term that was used, that there are some generations in that camp that have been displaced and put there that really can't go back home because of the conflict or changes in their circumstances, and really no path forward to move out and immigrate into another country. And so they've become very reliant on that need. They do have programs, or they're trying to do integration programs and try to help people out. It was certainly an eye-opening experience, and seeing a lot of things that a lot of Americans would never get to experience. So I felt fortunate to be able to be part of this food aid mission led by Peter, and do my best to try to convey the story and the importance of these programs, and try to think of ways forward.
Well, Peter, the next leg of your journey, I think, was also very interesting, too. You were almost treated like diplomats, is what I understand, because of the tariff situation. Be honest, I had to study up on my geography and looked at a map about us. But tell us about the country you went to that's landlocked in the middle of South Africa.
Lesotho is a unique one. It's one that probably most folks, myself included, wouldn't hear about unless it was something specific on the radar. And you're spot on. It's this very, very small, totally landlocked country kind of in the middle of South Africa. And so most of the time you'd say, oh, what are you going here for? And like I briefly mentioned earlier, there's a unique Food for Progress project that was funded through this wheat monetization sale in Tanzania. It's now funding a sort of NGO product with Land O'Lakes Venture 37 affiliate in Lesotho that's working on building up capacity in their poultry sector. So that's everything from broilers to layers to dual purpose chickens. And they're working across the entire value chain from producers to processors to developing end markets. And so it's a pretty comprehensive project to try and boost some of the food security resources there. What we didn't anticipate when we planned the trip is that it would be timed right about the same time as President Trump's announcement of reciprocal tariffs around the world. So being able to kind of reflect what a trade imbalance might look like between the United States and those countries. Lesotho in particular is a very, very small country, and so there's not a lot of market opportunities for the U.S. to send things there, but they have a very developed textile manufacturing industry. It sends a lot of blue jeans and other products to the United States. So you basically have a situation where the numbers show that they're sending way more to us than we are to them because there's not a lot of them to send things to. And so they had a pretty high reciprocal tariff rate to start out with. And so even though we were just going to really just see this USDA funded project, certainly don't represent the U.S. government. There was a lot of interest in that country from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Prime Minister's office, all on engaging with us on how we see the reciprocal tariff landscapes and opportunities to maybe even buy some U.S. wheat and other U.S. commodities to maybe offset some of that trade imbalance. And so it turned into an even more unique opportunity than we anticipated going into it.
Justin, you ended up being the highest ranking agriculture U.S. people in Lesotho at that time, apparently. And so what did they tell you? What did they want to hear from you?
Well, right. So we were 48 hours before we were about ready to fly into country is when we saw the announcement of Lesotho being at one of the highest tariff countries from the United States. And that got a lot of attention. But Peter and I were kind of right on the forefront of that, knowing that we were getting ready to visit Lesotho and be able to go in and have those discussions. And I think more than once I kind of heard the question of, why are we under siege? Like when you fly into that country, it's definitely see the level of poverty and 2 million people, not a situation where they are importing a lot and they're very dependent on the manufacturing that they do have in place. And so for me, it was kind of fascinating discussions to be there at that point in time, to be able to see, here we always, the tariff discussion has gotten so much attention, but to actually be there and kind of see the thought processes about how are they going to respond and questioning about how can they communicate and work with the United States to respond to that reciprocal tariff announcement was really fascinating for me to see, and clearly was not a spokesperson for the Trump administration by any means, and we had to reiterate that several times. It was purely coincidental that 2 people from the United States were flying in right after that announcement, but I do feel like we had really good conversations. It was fascinating to actually see the thought processes that they were going through and trying to find ways to work with USTR and give a response back. And of course, me with my wheat hat on, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I used it for my opportunity to say, you do have a flour mill. Let's find a way to get some U.S. wheat, hard red winter wheat in here, and it could create somewhat of a responsive win to the tariff situation, which is what these countries are looking for to try to find ways to respond to the tariffs.
We'll touch on tariffs in just a minute here, but the last part of your trip, another purpose of your journey, Justin, is U.S. Wheat Associates was having a Sub-Saharan African Buyers Conference in Cape Town, and You had an opportunity to present there, and I think you were able to deliver a message of the opportunity that exists for U.S. wheat right now that we haven't probably seen in quite a while.
Right. So there is this window of time that's opening. We could probably do a full podcast on talking about trying to re-engage with the Sub-Saharan African milling market and commercial opportunities for U.S. wheat, specifically hard red winter wheat. But that's kind of how Peter got me on the food aid mission the week prior, because I'd already had planned to be at the buyers conference and representing hard red winter wheat, and that's when I got the call from Peter kind of saying, hey, you're already in Africa, what are you doing like the 10 days ahead of that? And I'm like, oh my gosh, Peter. But it was just an unbelievable trip and an experience to be able to travel on. But this window of time for hard red winter wheat, specifically in markets that we used to have a huge presence in, that has changed over the last decade. Being able to be there and see buyers that you and I have met in the past, whether it was from Nigeria or South Africa or Mozambique or Tanzania, that were all represented at this conference, to re-engage with them, because that is a market where Black Sea wheat has been aggressively marketing and positioning themselves, that has displaced our market share. But with what's going on with Russia right now, currently with their wheat exports that have been tapering off the last several months, and with hard red winter wheat kind of being that reliable, consistent supply, being able to have those conversations and knowing that we are in the ballpark and trying to get from a price standpoint, and knowing to rebuild those relationships, knowing the reliability and consistency that comes with hard red winter or U.S. wheat, was really a unique opportunity to have those discussions. That I'm very hopeful that we see maybe some business, hopefully, because we need that demand. We need to expand that market share, and I think that is a unique opportunity that I'm really hopeful we'll see something come out of those discussions here in the near future.
Well, before we wrap up this discussion, gentlemen, Peter will give you the last word here, a chance to comment on tariffs as we record this. Obviously, it's a very fluid situation that changes day to day. What is U.S. Wheat Associates doing with our customers to try to reassure them about the marketplace for U.S. wheat?
Always happy to talk about this, even if there's changing news every day that it's probably outdated by the time somebody hears it. But I think the couple of most important messages are one, we've been pretty fortunate today to have very limited retaliation against U.S. wheat from customers around the world. And so I think that's been comforting to those folks as they've looked at being able to maintain kind of reasonable access to U.S. wheat at reasonable prices. You just haven't seen the retaliation on wheat that you have in maybe certain other sectors. And so we're very fortunate for that. The one area we've maybe had more concerns from customers than even tariffs recently has been U.S. Trade Representative's Section 301 investigation on Chinese shipbuilding and the Chinese shipping industry. We've ended up in a really good place with that one, actually. The Trade Representative's office took a variety of feedback, including from U.S. Wheat and other organizations that were concerned that some of the fee structures that were going to go in place on Chinese vessels were going to be especially challenging for bulk grain shipments. What we've seen in kind of the revised proposals there that maybe even still have some final tweaks to be made is that those fees have either been rolled back or created a variety of different accommodations that substantially reduce the impact on U.S. bulk grain exports. And so we're pretty optimistic we're going to end up in a good place there. And I think, again, it's been a lot of constant conversation with customers just to say, yep, we're tracking this as closely as you are. We're seeing the same things in the news. We're working really hard to make sure that we can continue to competitively export for the United States. That's definitely a priority for the Trump administration. And so anything that we can do to say this is what's good for shipping more product out of the United States, they're happy to hear it.
Well, we're glad to have U.S. Wheat Associates on the front lines there, representing Kansas wheat producers and wheat producers across the country.
As we wrap this up, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to make sure that when you run across a young person in their career that's very attentive and very good at what they're doing, it's something that we benefit from greatly. And so Peter's done a lot of great work for U.S. wheat farmers in Kansas, and it's been fantastic to work with. And I know he has, unfortunately for us, but fortunately for him, he's got some other career opportunities that are going to be ahead of him, but he's in a different capacity. He'll be representing U.S. agriculture on the front lines, and we'll be fortunate for that. But I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to make sure that we thanked Peter for all the work that he's done. And I know he's only going to be a phone call away, but Thanks for all that you've done for U.S. wheat farmers, specifically Kansas wheat farmers, Peter, and best of luck in your career and the next steps that you'll be taking in your career.
Thank you very much, Justin. I appreciate you saying that, and look forward to work with everybody even more in kind of the next opportunity here. It's been a great experience with the wheat community so far, and look forward to continuing that.
Well, Peter and Justin, thank you again for sharing information about your food learning journey. It helps reinforce the global reach of Kansas wheat and U.S. wheat and the importance of food aid programs. So thank you for your time. Thank you to Peter Laudeman with U.S. Wheat Associates and Justin Gilpin with Kansas Wheat for sharing the story of their journey of food aid through Africa. If you have a topic that you'd like to suggest for a future episode, or if you have a question to follow up on this episode, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.